I want to welcome everyone to our second annual Zoom Sage. Hope you find this course insightful for your understanding of the conflict. I want to thank the Temple Spice Committee for presenting these sessions, the Sage Subcommittee for organizing them, Tracy Lederer for her excellent administrative work, and most of all, Rabbi Knight for his inspiring teachings. So, Rabbi Knight.
Well, the teaching hasn't happened yet, so you might want to hold that thanks off for a little while. But most importantly, to Tracy for all of her support and everything, and helping to make sure that everything happens. I am deeply appreciative of. So thank you, Tracy, and thank you to Sage leadership and to really everyone who helped to make this happen. So I want to actually begin by actually talking about this class, and in some cases, the session that we're going to have today is really a sort of a precursor to sort of what we really want to talk about, and it is not going to go into some of the depth and detail, but I am going to open it up for some questions that has helped me understand sort of where you're at. So what I want to get at first is that I am not going to aim to shape or change your politics about Israel, right? I am not going to aim to change and shape the way that we, talk about, about whether it's politics in the United States or politics in Israel. Like, that is not my interest. What I do want to do is change and shape the way that we think and the way that we talk about Israel with each other. And in this case, what I also really talking about is with each other within the Jewish community, and talking about the dignity of difference. So when I sort of talk about like what's happening in Israel, I'm gonna sort of poorly attempt to share my slides. So hold on for 1 second. I think that when we talk about the sort of the dignity, the dignity of difference, as the class title suggests, very often what ends up happening is that the dignity of difference that is actually brought up is about the two narratives that exist inside of it in Israel, right? And that is the Palestinian narrative of the sort of spiritual and historic connection to the land and thousands of years of history in the land, Ottoman rule, British mandate, ending. Then you have what is in the Palestinian narrative, a fear of dispossession of the land, of 20th century Jewish immigration, of colonial, the impacts of many years of colonialism, whether it's British or French colonialism or Ottoman, control. You have their version of as they define it as the Nakba of 1948, the calamity and disaster for them, the 1948, and then you have really the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, and then after 1967, you might have the conversations about the Golan Heights and then in the north, and in Sinai Desert in the south. That is one narrative for sure. And then there's, of course, the Jewish or Israeli narrative, right, about the spiritual connection to the Holy Land that has lasted for thousands of years, which really goes back prior to that to a diaspora, right, from forcible removal from Israel by Rome. You have thousands of years of Jewish persecution, and inside of that Jewish persecution, absolute longing for return to Israel, and seeing Israel as not only a holy land but a sense of possibility. You have Jews who in Jewish tradition who really reinforce the Exodus narrative of seeing themselves in the sort of the land of Egypt, the Egypt being wherever we were. Egypt could have been in Poland, it could have been in Spain, and it could have been in Russia, and it could have been anywhere, and really seeing a potential longing for return to Israel. You have the Holocaust and forced expulsion from Muslim lands after the creation of the state of Israel in 1948. And then you also have, of course, the Independence War, 67, 1972, leading towards the first Intifada, and then becomes the second Intifada. And all of that is connected to this whole idea of Israel as a Jewish state, as a safe haven and spiritual. So when we talk about sort of the as a class, and the class sort of originally defines, as the dignity of difference, the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, I think that it is possible that you could have signed up for this class and anticipated that what I was going to be talking about was actually the dignity of difference with regards to Palestinians and Israelis. And there is a lot that we can talk about that. But I also think that what I'm actually talking about in terms of dignity of difference now is within the Jewish community, right? It's the dignity of difference within the Jewish community about how we think about and how we talk about Israel with each other. And I really forwarded the idea of this class with the SAGE committee as an idea that we need to learn how to talk about the values that we share, and not merely the politics that we don't share. We need to learn that political disagreement need not apply to a rejection or a dismissal of other people's values. And I really, really think that is an incredibly important statement, what I just said. I mean, not because I said it, and I don't want to be so full of myself that, what I just said is the most important statement that, that you could have heard today. But when you take a look at the political disagreements that are happening in our country right now, there is a basic assumption that political disagreement is not the beginning of a conversation, but political disagreement is the end of a conversation. Political disagreement is a way of vilifying others, where there are now public chants demeaning and demoralizing the other opinion, other sides, other opinion, politicians at baseball games and football games across the country, right? And in essence, what I'm really getting at is that we need to discover that by focusing on the values and the ideas which lie at the foundation of our politics, that we can foster greater understanding and greater respect for each other without whitewashing the differences. Did you hear what I want to make sure you heard what I said, right? And I think that is incredibly important, and that effectively, when we talk about the dignity, the reason why I sort of titled this "The Dignity of Difference" is that when we approach talking about Israel, or talking about Palestine, or talking about about the dynamics that are happening there, so often we in the Jewish community here are also wrapped up in frankly the rhetoric and the divisive way in which we are talking about American politics. That is not healthy. It is not healthy for the Jewish community. It is not healthy for our relationship with Israel. And it is not healthy for the kind of, I think, the kind of a community that can actually respect difference and respect complexity and respect a notion that there is more than one way to understand the world, right? And so, effectively, I want to get out at the front end. Again, my point is not to change your politics, but I am wanting to change and shape the way that we as a community at Temple Bethel are talking about Israel and Palestine with each other. And I think that if we can, in this class, do that well, we can actually create and support a healthier congregational community. And we can create and support a better, a public square for politics and political conversations in the United States. I'm going to pause for a moment right there. I know what I said may have jarred you, and you may have been like, "Well, that's not the class I just signed up for." So if you decide that you want to leave, we were not going to call out your name, right? Don't worry, right? But I do want to ask. I want to make sure that you understand at the outset sort of what I'm thinking. Okay. Are there any questions about what I just said? And you'd have to unmute yourself or raise your hand using. Yes.
Michael Marvin.
Hi, Michael.
Hi. Could you, it's a very interesting approach. Could you just give, for the group who's watching, a scenario, an example of what you mean by having our community at Temple of Bethel and the larger Jewish community, whether it's in Israel or anywhere in the diaspora, talking about talking about values and not politics. In other words,
Sure.
What is kosher? What is permissible, even though the two parties would end up with a difference of opinion?
Sure, we're gonna get into that. We'll get into that more. But let me try to say something about that.
Just an example, a hypothetical.
Yeah. So for example, let me give a couple. Let me give a couple of I'll give a couple examples, and we're going to talk about this more next session that I've been planning. So one example is a two-state solution, right? Two-state solution, right, where you could have a disagreement about whether or not what is security, and whether or not one group of people could approach it as Jews should not control another people, right? That Palestinians have rights, right, and right, and that Israel's occupation is destructive, and you could also have two states as a policy imperative, right? You could have two states as an aspiration, but that's not exactly where we're at. You could even argue that that two-state solution is not even a possibility, but really a one-state solution is actually a policy imperative for a variety of reasons, or that a one-state solution is a moral imperative. And so the sort of conversations that we have around politics, like policy here, right? In that sense, is the politics is the act of like what is in the polity and the public interest, right? That legitimate disagreements about these points can in fact be based in what it is that we value as individuals. And what I would say is that it does not necessarily lead us to say, well, you're just a colonial individual who is an oppressor, right? Like that kind of language has got to stop, and it's got to stop within the Jewish community, because it's not actually leading us towards productive conversation. I hope that makes sense. There may have been questions in the chat box that I have to tell you, I wasn't looking at it. Joan's listening from London. Great. Fantastic. Hopefully it's clear in London, which is great. And I agree, there's no bad time for waffles. All right. So any other questions about what I just said? All right. So the challenge over Zoom, of course, is that I'm going to ask you to participate. So one of the ways that I want to ask you to participate is actually first is actually to participate utilizing, and hopefully the document that I'm opening, you see, is I'm actually challenge you to participate. And I first want you to do this by yourself. And so this is going to be awkward because I'm actually going to create some silence here, right? And the silence is this. I want you to, at the very outset, if you don't have a piece of pen and paper, consider grabbing one real quick. Or if you do have a pen and paper, or if you use your phone, or if you're really good at just jotting it down your head, what I really want you to consider is really three questions, which really is the part that I want to get at, which is what Israel means first to you, right? To me, right? Like not to me. Like you don't need to talk about Israel to me, to you, right? But what does Israel mean to me? What does Israel mean to the Jewish people? And what does Israel mean to the world? And what I want you to do is I actually, in silence, and I'm going to give you a couple minutes to actually do this work, is to write that down for yourself. What does it mean to you, to the Jewish people, and to the world? And I'm going to invite some people to, I invite you to share in a moment, if you're comfortable and willing, but just take a moment in silence to fill that out. Brenda, I'll call on you in a second, okay? Let me give one more minute to people. Great. Another 20 seconds. So as we listen to what people say, if you identify with what someone else says, write it down as well, right? You can also write, there's nothing wrong with taking what someone else says and having that become your own, your own reality too. Like that's okay. And if there's something that doesn't jive with you for whatever reason, also, maybe mark that down and say like, wow, I really struggled with that idea. Okay. Because I want you to notice both what you identify with, but also what may make you feel a little more uncomfortable. And my guess, to answer sort of Michael's question earlier, is my guess is that it is possible that even in answering these like three questions, we're going to find some areas of disagreement that actually may reinforce the very need for the conversation I think we're going to have. Okay, so Brenda, I think I said that I would call on you, and then I see David's hand up and Milt's hand up, and if you can raise your hand. And if I don't call on you, it's because I'm operating on multiple screens, and so just unmute yourself too, and I will not take it. No, I will not take offense to you interrupting me. Brenda, do you want to go first?
Yes. As what Israel means to me, like the Italians connect with Italy, it means a homeland. And with the segregation that we are having in the United States, sometimes it's quite frightening. So it's nice to know there's a homeland. And what does it mean to the Jewish people? I think it means everything. It's a safety net. What does it mean to the world? I think it means a problem.
Thank you. I'm not going to comment. I just want to make sure that people hear where we're starting. So David, and then Milt, and then Sarah.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Very good. So question one, what it means to me. I agree with Tulushkin and Prager that Israel is one of the three pillars of Judaism: God, Torah, and Israel. Question 2, what does it mean to the Jewish people? There's a definition of home. Home is where, when you have nowhere else to go, they have to take you in. So to me, Israel is the home of the Jewish people where we have a right to return. What does it mean to the world? We're enjoined to be an Or HaGoyim, a light unto the nations. So with respect to Israel, we should act in an exemplary way, a way that reflects God, Torah, and Israel.
Great. Sarah, and then Milt, or yeah, Sarah the Milt. Sarah, I think you're on mute.
Unmute yourself, Sarah.
I'm trying.
You did.
To me, as I believe that whether you go to a synagogue or not, you should support it so that people have a place to go.
Okay.
And to me, that's what Israel means, that we have a place to go, and that for the Jewish people, we can go and hopefully be safe. I agree that it might be a problem, but I looked at it in a more positive, in that we're the inspiration and inventors and providers of so much progress in this world, with water, with medicine, etc.
Great. Okay. Fantastic. Milt.
Yeah, I wrote down a couple of words just because those are the words that quickly came to my mind. So they're not long explanations on them. What Israel means to me, there are 2 words. One is pride, pride in the accomplishments, the existence, the fantastic aspect and all that Israel has accomplished. And then there's also an equal feeling of anger for the policies to which Israel has followed through, and like my disagreement towards those policies. To the Jewish people, I felt the same thing. I felt we all feel pride towards the accomplishments of Israel, what it's done, its successes in science, et cetera, throughout the periods of time, and anger. What are you doing to this country? Why are you doing this in terms of its policies? And to the world, I just came up with anger. I think the world views Israel with anger over the policies that it does in its political aspects. I know I'm not supposed to say politics, but
No, it's okay. That's fine. That's great. Anyone else willing to share? Judy?
Okay. We'd like to address the third.
And then
about-
Friedman's next. So yeah, I think.
I
Yeah.
like to address the third. The world in many instances sees that this is the glue that's holding the Middle East together. So I guess that is political.
Mhm.
And also our non-Jews feel it needs to be protected at all costs because this is the land where Jesus was born and lived.
I was wondering when Jesus was going to be brought up, but I actually do think no. I'm really serious. Like I think that there's a big, I think there's a big aspect of about that, about how the world sees Israel. The Friedmans.
Yes, hi. So to me or to us, it's a safe haven for Jews. And it's also evidence that we will not be crushed, that we're resilient after thousands of years of others trying to crush us. To the Jewish people, pride, heritage, and also some frustration. To the world, we thought to democracies or for developing countries developing democratic countries, Israel's a partner and is inspirational and aspirational for them. However, to authoritarian governments that promote terrorism, I think they see Israel as threatening, and they're jealous of Israel's success.
Thank you. Jean, did you want to say something?
Okay. For both me and the Jewish people, those 2 categories, Israel exists as a safe refuge who have been persecuted and who still are in other lands. And for the world, what I just said validates that for other countries to emulate.
Oh, interesting. It actually is a model for refuge for people from around the world. Okay.
Exactly.
Great. Anyone? Bruce.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said about it being safe haven in the homeland, a Jewish homeland. I wonder if my secular friends out there in the world view it as a theocracy rather than as the only functioning democracy in that part of the world. Question mark.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. So yeah.
With some reservations about that.
Okay. Great. I saw another hand go up. Janice and Joel, Bob and Linda. Yeah.
You want us to go next?
Yeah, go for it, Janice and Joel. Yeah.
All right. So I said Israel is the land that God promised to Abraham and his descendants. And it's a very innovative country, but this is probably not going to be very popular. It perhaps lacks some of the freedoms that perhaps we have. And to the Jewish people, it's a safe haven. And I think somebody already mentioned this, but to the world, I said that they are often jealous because of the progress and innovations that such a small country has made. And I apologize for my voice.
That's okay. Bob and then Linda. Or Joel, did you want to say anything?
No.
Okay, great. Sorry.
Yeah, I agree with. Good.
Great, sounds good. Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, first to me, I think I see Israel in a schizophrenic fashion because I think of myself as an American Jew as opposed to a Jew who's an American. So I think there's that dichotomy to me as to where you draw the line, and there's always a tension between those two. To the Jewish people, I think.
Can I ask you a question about that tension?
Yeah.
So where do you see that tension come up for you?
Well, I think at times it has to do with how we support. I mean, it gets political. How do we support Israel, and when do we support it, and how far do we go? To the Jewish people, I think, along with everybody, I see it as a safety net. But I think it also is a place where, in order to provide that safety net, we have to be very careful to preserve the integrity of the Jewish state. And I mean the defense of the Jewish state as opposed to the moral side of it. And to the world, I see it as a conscience. It was created out of guilt in the Western world for what it failed to do to stop the Holocaust. And as that generation dies out and the memory of that dies out, I'm concerned that the world view of it changes with the narrative that's presented in media and press and in a variety of ways that forgets that Israel is there because Israel defended itself.
Great. Linda.
Okay, I'm going to give a personal example that really happened to me. I was going to Israel, and at JFK, I had to check in, and the person asked me, what's your name? I said, Linda Levy, and that's L-E. And I said, oh, I don't have to spell my name. You know how to spell Levy, because Levy's it's a Jewish name, and I belong here to the Jewish people. It's like other people said at home, a safe haven, free from persecution as Jews. And to the world, well, the innovation, the things that Israel has given to the world, from their technology to their medicine. Also, another particular example, when Haiti, not this last incident, but when Haiti had an earthquake several years ago, I think Israel was the first nation to go and offer aid. So that's what it means to the world.
Great. All right. So I'm going to ask for one more, and I'm going to be a little more directed in this one. And if they say they don't want to speak, we have some people who are also of a slightly different generation, and I'm not talking about myself. So would anyone who's from a slightly different generation be willing to unmute themselves and potentially just talk about from your perspective? The only reason why I say that is because there also may be some generational differences in how we sort of experience Israel. Courtney, I don't mean to necessarily pick on you. Courtney was like, "Don't pick on me, don't pick on me, don't pick on me." But would you be willing to unmute and share? If not, I totally understand. But you have to unmute to tell me not, if that's the case.
Sure, I'm taking a sneaky lunch break to do this, so forgive me if someone comes barging in. Yeah, I was surprised at how much I agreed with everyone. For me, when I think personally of Israel, as selfish as I can get, I think of adventure and all of the adventure that I had connecting with different people when I went on Birthright. But I also really think of Israel as more of a theoretical concept. So I am less attached to the land, maybe. And for me, I think of Israel as the people. And yeah, so for what I believe Israel means to Jews, I think it is a physical homeland, and I think it means security and identity. I really like what someone said about like it being a safety net, which I think because I don't have a lot of direct access to people who have dealt with persecution, I probably take that for granted a little bit. And to the world, I put that I think that we're perceived. I mean, I just went with what came out of my gut. So that we are that Israel is problematic, and it's just seen as like very problematic. And whoever said that it's perceived as a theocracy, for sure. But I also really like what someone said about innovators. It's an innovative nation.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I know that being called on by me to speak out loud is not always the greatest. So I really appreciate that. So I think that, you know, if you sort of listen to what we heard, we're sort of hear different aspects of Israel, you know, coming through. And you know, in some cases, what we've heard are you know, aspects of Israel that focus in on that focus in on Israel as land. We hear aspects of Israel as people. We hear Israel, you know, Israel as modern nation state. We hear Israel as protector and refuge, place of refuge to problematic and you know, aspects of technology. Courtney, I'm not going to also pick on Courtney again, but she's in the medical industry, and it is very often, I imagine, actually been really reading in the last year about all of the medical components of how Israel's been managing COVID, right? Which has been like, they've been like sort of, you know, Israel's been in the news a lot around its handling of COVID, partially because of the way that it the numbers of doctors, the studies, and its ability to actually do that, right? So Israel is a lot of things in this component, and so I think that I'm glad that we heard sort of all that. So here's sort of some of the things that I think is important. So being part of the people, right? The Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, is, as someone previously said, like, what are the pillars of Israel? You have, you know, you have the land, the people, and the people of Israel, the different pillars of Israel. Like Torah, God, Torah, Israel is one of the three pillars. But when you take a look at Israel, you also talk about sort of different forms of Israel, and we talk about, you know, peoplehood, aminut. That being part of a people is one of the deepest and most essential aspects of our Jewishness. And that one of the central motivations, right, for this conversation is to sustain sort of a question of like, what is Jewish peoplehood in the face of the realities in which we're living in, the realities that sometimes feel very threatening and are very threatening, and sometimes the realities that sometimes potentially undermine our sense of peoplehood. Since its inception, the state of Israel has, in many, many ways, particularly for the majority of the people who are in the generation, in this class, Israel has served as a unifying force in world Jewry. Ritual in prayer. There's always the Reformed, conservative, and Orthodox ritual and prayer sometimes actually divided us, but in many ways, supporting Israel was something that for many years transcended some of the differences that we had. Right, you could have been in a Reformed synagogue or a conservative synagogue or an Orthodox synagogue. And you may have disagreed on a lot of different things and not even like seen eye to eye at all on a lot, but actually Israel could have been one of the things that you could have seen eye to eye on. You may not have gone to each other's synagogues, but you could potentially celebrate with each other at your sort of community Israel Day parade or your Yom HaAtzmaut celebration, or in support of Israel in a lot of different other ways. The challenge, however, is that just by what we heard, is that actually Israel does not necessarily serve as a cohesive force for Jewish peoplehood in the way that I think it did for previous generations, and Israel has become a source, and I think some would even argue the source of deep divisiveness, acrimony, and mutual alienation that is really greater than any of the denominational divides that we have within the United States. Our goal as we sort of look at this, is to sort of consider this phenomenon and to sort of provide tools for us to have real conversations about how we are building a relationship with Israel, but also talking really openly and frankly about the areas of conflict and disagreement in the Israel conversation. We can no longer argue that we can put aside for now the areas that we disagree on, given the sort of extenuating circumstances in the current crisis of the situation. So often we often said, look, Israel's in a crisis. Let's just put away the differences right now and let's focus in on getting Israel through the crisis. Israel's, you can't talk about what's actually going on or the real conflict because there's the Palestinian question. You can't talk about whatever it is because Israel's getting bombed in Gaza, right? And that's true, but it's also important that there's to understand that there may always be a current crisis, right? That current crisis is like not going away, and we need, I think, to learn to talk with each other and to think about Israel within a crisis reality, right? If crisis isn't ending and there's always going to be the next crisis, we can't just put off the conversations about Israel and about Palestine and about what's and about the differences that we might have and the areas of agreement that we might have. We can't just put that conversation off until Israel's not within a crisis, because we never really know when the crisis is going to the next hit. Last year there was a crisis of COVID and a crisis of Gaza, and it's an impossible reality to just kind of push that off. But to have the conversation, I think it means that we need to challenge ourselves to develop new ways of thinking about Israel and talking to each other about precisely the areas of deep dispute, right? That we want to confront in this class the most difficult issue, which is dividing us today in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think some people wonder how they can understand, relate, and identify with an Israel whose policies are so different from their own. And I think others wonder how they can talk with and tolerate Jews who advocate for positions which they can both profoundly disrespect, but also feel are profoundly dangerous to the future and security of Israel. Right? And so what we're trying to aim here, as I said before, is the way that we think about politics and think about the way that we talk about Israel. And I think our assumption should be, and I think my hope is that your assumption is going to be, is that that we are all good people. We are all decent people, intelligent and informed, and that good, decent, intelligent, and informed people can confront a set of facts and a particular reality and reach really different and legitimate conclusions. And so what I want to ask you is to set aside, if you can, as much as you can, your personal political positions. I want you to set aside your takes, if you will, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I want to invite you to open your ears and your hearts to hear and to learn from others. I think that it might be helpful to remember that when we talk about Israel and we talk about Palestine, we are not deciding at this moment on the future of Israel and or Palestine. We are deciding, however, on the future of how our community can, in fact, relate and talk about Israel and talk about the possibility of a Palestine and talk about the impacts and what's going on there. That does make a difference. Like, I don't mean to say this in a truly dismissive way, because I think you all have impact and power within the community and in the world, but there's pretty much nothing that this group of people are going to do that is going to like directly impact like what's actually happening in Israel right now, right? So spoiler alert, we're probably not going to be able to do that much. But what we can impact is the culture of how our community talks about Israel and how we engage with each other in this conversation. And that we can impact greatly. We can set the foundation for how these conversations really need to be occurring. And so, as we delve deeply and engage in the ideas and the values, which are the underpinnings of the conflict, instead of just the facts and the politics of the conflict, it's our sort of sense that my sort of sense that that the sort of commonly held system of values and ideas and ideals that we have, at the very least, can form a sort of a shared respect for our differences. And that shared respect for our differences is achievable here. So I want to talk about the centrality of the values. As a community at Temple Bethel, I think we really need to remember that the values that we live by and the values that we aspire towards are the essential of who we are, right? The story of the Jewish people is about a commitment that you all spoke about. Just, I wrote it all down. Like, it's about a commitment to this place of ideas and values in the real world. And so a Jewish discussion of policies and politics is really about bringing values into the real world. So often I am told, Rabbi, we don't want you to talk about politics, right? And I hear that. But very often one of the responses that I have around that is that it's not just about talking about politics or policies, but rather it's really about how we're bringing our Jewish values into the role of the real world. And I think that that if I could say anything, I think that it's that we need to learn to talk about the values that we share and not merely the politics that we don't share. We need to learn that political disagreement is the beginning of a conversation and not its end. We need to learn that political disagreement really does not need to imply a rejection or a dismissal of another person's values. We need to discover that by focusing on the values and ideas which lie at the foundation of our politics, that we can foster greater understanding and greater respect for each other without whitewashing our differences. And yeah.
Question.
By all means.
Michael. So I understand where you're going. So how do we deal with the following? Two influences on an all too frequent example: the killing of children, be they Palestinian or Jewish, whatever the mechanism is a result of the conflict. Let's just accept that. And how do we then have that conversation? Because it is, one, heavily influenced by the media, how it's reported, how it's shown on TV, etc. And secondly, it's influenced by what the core moral values are of Palestinians and Jews about children's lives. Just as a hypothetical example, can we find a common ground to be respectful and listen to one another when that's the issue?
Okay, so let me Michael, let me try to answer that question by let me try to answer the question, and if I don't quite get there, I want to try to answer it, but I want to try to get there in a different way than sort of directly addressing the issue, if that's okay. So let me try to answer that, because I understand. So the first thing is, yeah, go ahead. Okay, so when we talk about, so first off, very often disagreement about Israel's politics or the policies and the application of the politics and the policies is actually a motivation for disengagement from the very conversation about Israel in the first place. So I think for a lot of Jews, when they look at what's happening around, let's say, the killing of children, right, they actually sort of they find it so increasingly divisive and so problematic that it becomes the conversation about Israel becomes an irrelevant reality, and that they choose actually to disengage from Israel and the conversations about it altogether, right? And what I'm sort of getting at is that that through sort of the values conversation, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, that through the values conversation, we create the possibility of sort of connecting with Israel's story and a larger Jewish story, which sort of transcends political and geographic divides, and that we can create, new connections with Israel and with each other that help us actually to confront those very issues and really get to it. So here's the challenge. Some people argue, right, in the conversation about, let's say, children who have been killed by Israeli defense forces. Some people will argue, who are we to tell Israel what to do, right? You don't live in Israel. You don't live with a security situation. You haven't had children who have strapped bombed themselves or have been throwing, like, who are you to tell Israel what to do? And who am I to tell Israel what to do? And I think it's a common refrain that is, in fact, hindering an open discussion, in the sense that we ought not to tell Israel what to do, since our lives are not really on the line, right? And I think that there is a distinction between telling someone else what to do and telling someone else what you think. sharing one's thoughts is an act of friendship, right? Sharing one's thought is an act of enrichment and empowerment. And so, it doesn't mean that, that like, if you disagree with the killing of children, I think that the distinction is that you can actually tell people, you can actually share, what it is that you think and what it is that is troubling you. And that in doing so, that is an act of friendship, enrichment, empowerment, and doesn't have to get into the question of like, well, your life isn't on the line, so therefore you shouldn't have any sort of comment or say or conversation about that.
That's what I was looking for. Thank you. That's what I was looking for.
Okay. So
two moms, one Palestinian, one Israeli, regardless of how their children are killed, can commiserate, can share their anguish and their sense of loss without it ever getting into politics or where they live, etc. The value is that they've lost a loved one.
I guess my premise is that all conversation, even ones which we believe may cross the line between sharing what we think and what and sort of telling what to do, are better than the alternative, which is no conversation at all and then disengagement from the conversation altogether. Right? That in today's world, we do not protect Israel when we limit conversation. We actually, I think, are endangering it in brand new and powerful ways, because we are stopping people from engaging in the conversation at all. I would rather us talk about it, but having us talk about it in ways that are productive. Does that make?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay. I see Brenda's hand up and I see Bob's hand up, and there may be more hands up. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, when you said, what right do we have to express our feelings to Israel? There are many, many Jewish organizations that support Israel. The hospital is supported by Hadassah. The schools are supported by Ort. I think we really do have some rights. Not their government, but we could state our feelings to them.
Right. And then that can be an act. What I'm saying is, Brenda, is I agree with you that stating the way that we think about it is a act of friendship. Right. And that can be seen as that. But my concern is that the statement, who are we to tell Israel what to do, or who are you to tell Israel what to do, is actually limiting the conversation about Israel. And that's what I don't want to have happen. Bob and then David.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. If I understand exactly what you're saying, because my concern is over years that people use, we shouldn't talk politics as an excuse for saying, I don't want to hear what you have to say. I automatically know in advance the toxicity of what you have to say, and I don't want to put up with it. As opposed to saying, we can talk about politics, but how do we talk about politics? And it has to be with respect for each other. And the most important part of all of it is listening.
Right. And so, Bob, I that's exactly what I'm saying. And my point is that by shutting the conversation down, it is actually having the adverse effect of having us disengage from conversations about Israel altogether. And that is actually a profoundly dangerous problem for the Jewish community in the United States, right? That we are disengaging from the conversation is precisely what shouldn't be happening. And if we say, well, I don't want to listen. I don't want to talk about. I don't want to talk about politics. In other words, like I don't want to have to listen to what you have to say, right? That actually is actually creating new problems that I think the unintended consequences we do not yet know. And I think that when you take a look, frankly, at the younger generation of Jews who have lots of different opinions than older generation. I mean, even myself, like I was on a phone call this week and I emailed the person of the phone call and I was like, who led the phone call. And I said, I have to be honest. for the very first time really felt, I had felt old for a lot of different reasons with having kids and whatever, but I felt really old on this conversation, on this phone call this week. I felt really not like, I was like, wow, I am in a different generational place than the other people who are on this call, and it happened. And I was like, November 7th, 2021, I reached that point where I was like, what is happening? But I think that the problem is that when we say, like, I don't want to hear your politics, it actually tells even the younger generations, your thoughts and your ideas and the values that are informing you are not actually included in the conversation. And I think it's really dangerous right now, because I think it's disengaging younger generations from really being committed to having a conversation about Israel and being committed and knowing even more about Israel. So that's that. Bob, you hit it on the head.
Yeah, and just one more thought about it is, as we learn to do this through this process, hopefully in this year's Sage, as a Jewish community, the skills we learn also can apply to the broader scope of America, politics, all these kinds of things, where we've all stopped listening to each other and we just talk at each other.
Bingo. That's the point, is that this actually, to me, when we talked about the dignity of difference, this is an opportunity for us to have a serious conversation about what does the public square of dialogue actually need to be in the United States and within our own community. We need to have a community that has the wherewithal to confront challenging issues. And if not here, then where? Because it's not happening in the public square, right? The public square is not inviting a dialogue between, we now have political parties that feel like they're on different planets, but also B are literally talking like this. It's they're not even engaging in that conversation. And we need to practice the public square that I think is going to hopefully reshape and rethink what this looks like in the United States. And if not at Temple Bethel, then where are we having those conversations? Not in the safety of our own community, where? David, you had your hand up?
Yes. So I want to address the question of protecting Israel. Sometimes one sees this as a straw man. So I want to address it as someone who is a boy, saw a number of displaced persons who made their way to my homeland in Canada with numbers burned into their flesh when they were prisoners of the Nazis. I think we can agree that Israel has to be protected without agreeing that we're going to side with the Israeli government in all of their decisions. So I think it's a Jewish value that we want to protect Israel. So the question becomes how? How can people do this? How can people interact in a way to do this? The answer is politics. Politics has to do with interactions of people. So what is politics? It's the art of the possible. We all heard Henry Kissinger say that, but it's older than that. Maybe it goes back to Metternich or something like that from the 19th century. So what's possible?
Can I comment on that?
Please.
Yeah. So I think that what David, what you're bringing up is what I have been sort of talking about actually within our Charlotte Jewish community for a period of time right now. I just actually wrote a letter to a series of across the Charlotte Jewish community around this issue of what I'm talking about as sort of zero-sum thinking. And the concern that I have, and to your point, David, is that this is not a zero-sum game. When we're talking about values as distinct from debating, about politics, I think it's really important to remember that we're not talking about a zero-sum game at all, where if I accept one value, then by definition of accepting that value, I negate all of the other values. A values conversation is inherently a more tolerant and complex one, because I can accept a value as being important without claiming that it is the only value which is important, right? I can accept a value as part of a larger whole without having to argue that the value itself constitutes the whole, right? And I can respect a value as valuable, but believe that that under certain circumstances, it can be implemented or needs to be deferred in the face of conflicting values and conflicting circumstances. So I think that if we remember this, we're going to be able to sort of keep an open heart and an open mind to hear other people, that we will be able to learn more about ourselves and about what motivates other people in this group if we create a safe space where ideas can be put forth and valued without worry that the so-called ideological price of what you might have to pay is for hearing or for respecting one another and the differences of opinion that we might have.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yes, yeah. I'll agree that I may be somewhat guilty of that zero-sum point of view that you addressed, but frankly, I've heard it expressed by others today as well. For example, there seems to be a straw man dichotomy that was set up the way I heard it, excuse me if I didn't understand the speaker correctly, between Israel being a theocracy or a democracy. I would say a better way of framing the question would be, should it be a democracy or a Jewish state, if it comes down to that? So I think each of us should ask, how do we view ourselves in relation to Israel? So let me give you a 10-second answer for me that perhaps will help everyone answer that question for themselves. I was a Canadian Jew. My identity as a Jew was beaten into me by Germans who had come over to Canada after the war. I understood I was a Jew because they beat it into me. So I became a Jewish Canadian. I'm an American by choice. I'm a Jewish American, not an American Jew if it comes down to it. That's who I am, but I'm willing to listen to others and soften it so that it isn't just a zero-sum game. I suggest this is a good way for all of us to ask, how do I see myself and others and relate to them? Remembering that politics is the art of the possible.
Great. Okay. All right. Anyone else before I want to be conscientious of time? I want to say one last piece before we sort of break up into some conversation. Is that okay?
Can I say something about Mark?
Yeah, but we're going to be brief because I'm going to reserve the right to cut you off because I want to make sure that we're able to move on to the next piece. Yeah, Bob.
I just wanted to support you, and Alba Adams in politics says the same things, and why we have the importance of religion and what you were saying, and that we needing to ask the right questions of why are we making culture wars on each other? And can't we talk about how do we create a more ethical and holy space?
Great.
And work in relationship together.
Great.
Instructive engagement.
Thanks, Bob.
And thank you for your talk. Thanks.
So as we're in the sort of first session, I'm going to go over what we're going to be talking about in a second. I just think it's really, really important, and I want to set it up at the beginning so that if this is the wrong class for you, by all means, I won't be. I hope you engage in the conversation. But here,
you're mute.
You're on mute.
All right, someone muted me. I don't know how I got muted. I got muted. I think Tracy has that power, and she's my assistant, and this is what happens. She's been waiting all day to mute me. I just want to be really, really clear. She's like, I have the power to mute my boss. This is awesome. All right, so thanks, Tracy. All right, so here's the thing. And setting expectation clearly. This is not a course on the introduction to Israel, and this is not a Zionism 101 course, and this is not a history of the peace process course or a platform to debate and advocate certain policies regarding to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. This course is an opportunity to study Jewish values, to talk about the dignity of difference, to examine our own value priorities, to understand how Jewish values shape our aspirations for Israel and how Jewish values can influence our policy perspectives. It's an opportunity sort of to have a respectful dialogue with fellow members of our community about with whom we can disagree about Israel politics. And I think finally, what I would say is that I hope it will help us grapple with some of our relationships to Israel as Jews living in an era of Jewish sovereignty outside of the land of Israel. This course, I'm going to say this again over and over again. what this course is and what it is not. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because I think the more that we understand this, the more I think shape the course in a way that avoids some of the polarizing conversations and letting things go off the rails. So know that I'm as a facilitator of this conversation, I'm going to, if something moves in that direction that is really, really that is really, gets into like, well, this is, what Zionism is, or this is what the history of the peace process, like you have to understand the history of the peace, like that's not necessarily how I want to engage in this class. We are not here to determine if there is a Palestinian peace partner or a specific policy on the settlements, or whether or not it's realistic or not to have a two-state solution or one-state solution. But the goal of the course is to have an internal Jewish conversation about our values and our aspirations and our hopes and our visions for Israel. Okay? And in so doing, as Bob Wolf said in his brilliant way, I hope create a platform for conversation that I think is desperately needed in this day and age of unbelievable polarization, in which political differences are not tolerated or even allowed to be discussed in a respectful, kind, values-based way. Does everyone understand that? Okay. That I think is what I wanted to get across today. Now, what I want to show you is sort of where we're going and what I hope we're going to discuss. And that requires me to figure out what I did with the, hold on for 1 second. Sorry. Apparently I accidentally closed the document that I had open, and I'm going to now reopen it. I know that you guys probably don't need the actual dialogue of what's going on in my head as I figure out what's open on my computer or not, but so I apologize. All right, so when I think about Israel, I have a chance to answer this. I very much think about this. I always go back to the foundational document of Israel, because I think it is, for me, like so defining of like a lot of what I think about. And so I think about sort of the birthplace of the Jewish people and the spiritual, religious, and political identity that was shaped there, and the way in which we attained statehood originally and created cultural values that we still live by, that have often universal significance, right? That gave to the world the book of books, the Torah. Right. And I think about our history and how in each generation we strove to reestablish ourselves in the land of Israel. That, for me, is what, when I start thinking about Israel, but I'm a rabbi, like that's where my head goes. So here's what we're going to be talking about. In session 2 in December, we're going to be talking about the spectrum of views that exist within community. And then we're going to be talking about sort of how living with difference, and living with, and how we live with that difference. We're talking about, in session 4 in February, the Israel that we imagine, right? And then we're going to talk about Jewish narratives of peace and our attitudes towards lands. And of course, session 7 is going to be a concluding conversation, but also a conversation about self-preservation and continuity. And my hope is that as we have these conversations, we can be really intentional about it. Now, one of the things that Sage has also consistently done is had opportunities for chavruta and conversation. And I will readily admit that it has been sometimes difficult to have those conversations in a dynamic with Zoom. So what we're doing is we're going to allow for people to have a conversation in small groups, and still actually have it. I am putting into the box right now discussion questions that we want to invite you to potentially consider and discuss. And you'll see, and I'm going to go over. The discussion questions are this. One, would you characterize the Israel conversation in our community, right, as healthy or toxic, right? It doesn't have to be those polar, like it could be anywhere in between that, right? Why do you think it is that way? Why do you think that the Israel-Palestinian conflict is such a hot button issue? In our community, do conversations about Israel and the Israel-Palestinian conflict focus on debates about facts or values? Sorry, I didn't mean to have an extra bullet point there. Have you thought about the values that animate your political positions? And what do you think are the most important values that drive your political opinions? And then also, are there opinions about Israeli politics that you find very difficult to hear? And what do you do when someone in your community espouses political views about Israel with which you strongly disagree? So for those who want to, continue that conversation, Tracy is going to split us up into groups, and you guys can have this conversation about what's in the conversation about those particular questions. And if not, we will see you in December for our next session of Sage. And I want to thank you. And by the way, if what you heard today sounds compelling to you and interesting to you, and you think that there's someone here or in the community that you think should be a part of this conversation, invite them. We've recorded this session. They can watch the first session, and then they can join us for the other session. So by all means, you can invite them to the session. We're open for registration still. Okay. Thanks, everyone.